The Pads went on today. Who won the battle in the trenches? And just how pro-ready is Michael Penix Jr.?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. And, of course, I've been covering the Falcons for so many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. And I thank each and every one of you that is an everydayer of this podcast. And if you want to become an everydayer and make this podcast your first watch, your first listen each and every day, of course, all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, I am joined by none other than Josh Kendall of The Athletic. Of course, he covers the Atlanta Falcons. He's been on hand at every day of Falcons training camp. And Josh, we've had 5 practices so far. Today on Tuesday was the first padded practice. So my first question is, what stood out to you today and what has stood out to you so far through 5 days of training camp?
2 things stood out today. That the young defensive line, even really the whole defensive line, but it stands out when the second team is on there against the first team defense or the first team offensive line. You know, that's still a work in progress from a personnel standpoint, from an alignment standpoint. They're still playing with a ton of guys. Dorless. I saw Dorless get snaps today before Aroro, which was surprising to me. I saw Trice go with the ones, which felt like a step forward for him. But the biggest point I'm saying from that is that group is not ready to play a starting NFL offensive line. I mean, the Falcons starters, who in my opinion, I don't know about everybody else's, are above average. Good to, some days really good as an offensive line. They handled themselves in the run game pretty well today. The second thing probably was that I noticed was that Michael Penix's accuracy was not great. He had a great day the first day they were out here. Next day was a little shakier. Today, with quote unquote, with everything being quote unquote live, it was another little bit of a step back. Nothing that I think, that's worrisome at all. Still throws a beautiful ball, but just more confirmation if anybody needed it. And I'm not sure anybody does, but if anybody needed it, more confirmation, there's not a quarterback competition. I mean, Kirk Cousins has looked really good, everything they thought he would look like from the moment he stepped in the building through this afternoon when they finished practice. So those, Penix, still getting his feet under him, and the defensive line, not being quite ready for prime time yet, or what stood out.
I think it's interesting you bring up Penix because we spend a lot of time talking about Kirk Cousins and how sharp he's looked so far in training camp. And, there has been some positives from Penix. I kind of noticed that trend at the Senior Bowl for the 3 days of practice. Like the first day, I think, was his best day. And then things kind of tapered off after that point in time. So I'm just curious, in terms of, as you mentioned, Penix obviously is not going to be starting games, although we'll get to that first preseason game. If he lights it up, you'll hear something, Josh. I'm sure you'll see some comments on some of the articles you're writing after that game. But I am curious, does it feel like this is a work in progress, a multi-year work in progress, or is this a guy that in the event that, Kirk Cousins gets nicked up during the season, you feel like this guy has shown enough that you feel like he's ready to step in and play games right away?
If, sort of the worst, the most Falcons luck thing ever happened, and Kirk Cousins, at the midpoint of the year goes down and can't play, and Michael Penix has to play significant snaps. At that point, I think Michael Penix would absolutely be ready to give you a chance to win. I think if Michael Penix is thrown into action week 10, Atlanta will be better off than they were any of the weeks the previous 2 seasons with the 2 previous guys they had. Okay. I think Michael Penix is going to be a good quarterback. I think the jury is still out on how good, but I think he can handle the position. I don't think it's too big for him. So I think Michael Penix, would be ready in that scenario. Week 1, that's not too far down the road. but give him a little time. It's a process.
Okay. Well, I think that answers my question when it comes to sort of Penix, and we'll get to see quite how ready he is when he gets some of these preseason snaps in the upcoming weeks. But I want to talk a little bit more about the guys that are catching passes from both Michael Penix and Kirk Cousins. Talking with Josh about sort of Kyle Pitts' camp so far, as well as Drake London's. We'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So, guys, because you aren't able to get down to Falcons training camp practice on a daily basis, I'm sure there are certain things that you would like to do with your mornings and afternoons, and you can do that by getting back into the ballpark and Game Time. An authorized ticket marketplace for Major League Baseball is going to help you out. They take the guesswork out of buying tickets, whether it's for baseball, other sports, comedy, music, theater, whatever event is near you. Game Time is going to help you out. We love the views from your seat, those panoramic seat views where you can see and line up the perfect spot to catch that fly ball or that foul ball to take as a souvenir from those Braves games or wherever you're at. And of course, make sure you shop their flash deals where you can save on exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game. And to take advantage of this, download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your purchase. Download Game Time today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So as I mentioned earlier, Kirk has been impressive so far in training camp. I know he threw his first, I guess, official pick. I know there was some controversy a couple of days ago about whether or not the pick he had against Troy Anderson counted, but I know Jesse Bates was able to pick him off today in practice. But another player that has impressed so far by several accounts so far in training camp is Kyle Pitts. I'm curious what stood out from Kyle Pitts so far in camp, and particularly today on Tuesday with their first padded practice.
Well, what stood out to me is that DeMarco Hellams, they stuck DeMarco Hellams on him 3 times in low red zone, one-on-one snaps, and it didn't go well. That was a tough matchup for Hellams. In those, and who is a big physical guy in his own right. In those snaps, you saw what everybody wanted to see what the Falcons saw when they drafted Pitts 4th overall. What Arthur Smith went to bed at night dreaming about in the red zone. You saw it. The problem is you saw it in one-on-one drills at the start of practice. Now, Friday night, days are running together. Saturday night at Second-Year High School, in full field work, he looked good. He got open. Yes, all positive signs. For me, I've still got to see it on the field. I told somebody, I think it was earlier today, if you're asking me to grade my confidence, make confidence picks on these last 3 offensive stars that Atlanta drafted in terms of who is going to really step up this year, my personal confidence picks would be Drake London at the top, Bijan, and Kyle. Doesn't mean Kyle won't do it. It just means, I want to see a little more against a real opponent.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I think the point that maybe you're making is like everybody is very much aware of how talented Kyle Pitts is. It just hasn't necessarily translated on the field in a consistent way that I think envisioned. And I think a lot of that is owed to the injuries the last couple of years. I'm assuming based off of how he's performed these last couple of days of practice, it looks like he's back fully healthy. There are no concerns about that knee.
It does, but in the scenarios where we've seen him get himself open, from my really untrained eye, it has been scheme related and defense still kind of, learning, going against second team defense, and they're still learning their way. It's not as if we've seen him, line up at X and just go and beat somebody. And be, that Kyle Pitts. I think of the Kyle Pitts play for me that sticks in my mind is, I guess, 2021 in New Orleans, and when they're trying to come back down the field to kick that field goal, and he catches one down the right sideline. I haven't seen that Kyle Pitts, but we wouldn't see that. You're not going to see that in a practice scenario.
Now, you mentioned the other 2 stars in Drake London and Bijan Robinson. There hasn't been a ton of buzz for Drake London so far in training camp. I'm just curious what, is that a fair assessment for him, and sort of what do you sort of read in Drake London's camp so far?
Yeah, if you're stacking up the guys, if I'm closing my eyes and envisioning the guys I can think about making plays in training camp, Kyle is high on that list because we've paid so much attention to him, and he has had some good days. But, I can picture in my mind's eye Ray McCloud more than I can Drake London right now. And part of that's because I'm watching McCloud more because he's new and you're trying to figure out how he fits and what they think of him. So it's not like Drake has gotten just a ton of balls in camp. That doesn't make me worry at all about Drake. He looks healthy when he's in there. He's lined up in various spots in the formation. I'm really interested to see what they do with him in the slot this year. But he has had a quiet camp. There haven't been any big buzzy plays. That does not change my opinion on what kind of season he's going to have.
Yeah, I think that's fair. At the end of the day, I have to say the thing. We're talking about practice, not necessarily games. I think we know what Drake London can bring to the table in the games, and I think a lot of people are really excited to see what he can do in this offense as potentially a featured weapon. Getting to the other guy, tell me about Bijan's camp so far.
Has looked good. He's clearly the starting running back. It's not a 1 and a 1A. It's Bijan, and then they're gonna figure out how to get Tyler Algier on the field and his snaps. He is more of a running back than an all-purpose offensive weapon in this system. I think that'll probably help him. He is excited about what he has explained as more variety in the run game than he saw a year ago. So, everything has been positive. This is not a setting, and I'll keep saying this again and again just because I think it's true. This is not a setting where you can see what makes Bijan Robinson really, really special, because what's going to make him really, really special if he turns out to be that is that half a second at the point of real contact, which these guys are not. They're not going to the ground. So it's a lot easier to come up and tap Bijan on the hip than it is in live action scenario to get your arms wrapped around.
Okay. Well, we've talked quite a bit about the Falcons' offensive stars and how they have performed so far in training camp. I want to talk a little bit more about the defense and whether or not the offense's success should we read into that and as a measuring stick of the defense, and we'll pick Josh's brain on that to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So it is the summertime, and even though we are ramping up for the NFL season, the sports aren't always sporting like we want them to at this point in the calendar, and that's where FanDuel is going to help keep the party going, because they're going to hook up all of their customers with a daily boost or bonus. That's right, there's something for everyone every day all summer long. All you got to do is head over to FanDuel.com, and you can make the most out of your summer. If you want to bet on the upcoming NFL season, of course, FanDuel has you covered. The upcoming NBA season, you want to check out some of these Olympic things going on? Hey, Major League Baseball, FanDuel, of course, has you covered on all respects. You want to bet on how many touchdowns and yards Kirk Cousins is going to throw for. You can do that. Over-unders for Kyle Pitts, Bijan Robinson, Drake London as well. All available at FanDuel.com. So start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel is an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. So, Josh, I'll be upfront. I've been saying to my listeners all offseason long to set their expectations low for the Falcons defense. I'm curious, what are your expectations for the Falcons defense this year? Do you expect that unit to take a step forward or take a step back this year? And sort of what is your read so far through 5 days of practice with that unit?
It's hard to say whether I expect them to take a step forward or take a step back. And I say that because it's hard to evaluate, for me anyway, exactly what Atlanta's defense was last year, because you can look at some numbers where they were statistically between 10 and 15 in defense. But you also have some memories as a Falcons fan of some really bad fourth quarters. So I think that this defense would hope to be a little more stable, not as up and down, particularly as down in the fourth quarter like they were last year. But I don't think the defense is going to be good. That was answer that question. I'm with you. Nothing I've seen in training camp changes that. The first team offense has, I think, in most cases, gotten the upper hand without much problem. Problem is the wrong word. One of the issues with the way Raheem Morris has approached this camp, and you totally understand why he's approached this camp. He's an encourager. He's a positive guy. He's going to instill belief in his guys. So when you talk to him today, he just loves like 9 defensive linemen on this team. They're great. They're going to be great. How much of that is, we're going to speak that into existence, and how much of that is, these guys are really going to be above average NFL players in week 1. I don't know. I still believe the offense has got to carry this team.
Okay, I think that's fair. I think it's interesting on your colleagues' podcast, Scoop City, with Diana Rossini and Chase Daniel over at The Athletic. Go check it out. And he was sort of being asked about Raheem Morris and talking about how the way that Raheem addresses the team and some of the team meetings is his positivity and sort of talking about players as he wants them to be. And so the more he speaks that into existence, the more players sort of envision that, yes, I am actually as good as that. And then hearing as well, another podcast that dropped today, the Pivot podcast, where Raheem was on there with Channing Crowder and Ryan Clark and Fred Taylor. And they were talking about, and I think Ryan Clark, was who it was, sort of specifically was like, I guess being antagonistic about the defense and being like, this defense isn't very good. And Raheem was, very much hit back talking about some of the young players. And so that seems to vibe with what you're saying, where I think the Falcons have a belief in their youth that these guys are going to step up. But it is one of those things where, it sounds like you're of the same mind as I am, where it's like, I'll believe it when I see it at this point. Is that fair?
Yeah. And I just don't, the way Raheem approaches things can end up being a trap for the fan base unintentionally. If you know what I'm saying. Like, I don't want the fans to think, wow, we're going to be better than we thought we were on defense. Listen to how this guy talks. Or at least I want them to understand why he's saying things the way he's saying it. And don't start thinking, I think the defense is going to be great.
Yeah. Okay. All right, Josh, let the people know. I appreciate your insight into Falcons training camp. Look forward to getting back with you, maybe when we have a couple of games under our belt to talk about, third string position battles in the preseason. And then, of course, when we get later in the season. But let the people know sort of some of the things you're working on and some of the things that are coming their way over at The Athletic.
Find us all, me and all of us at The Athletic. Later this week, I think I'm going to try to figure out how the Falcons are marrying, the run game of the last 3 seasons which is just heavy wide zone, with what the Rams have done the last 3 seasons, basically, which is kind of bounced back and forth between heavy gap scheme and the wide zone, and what it'll look like when they put all that together.
One quick question I'll ask you, Josh. Has there been any player that if you had to redo your 53-man roster projection, you would change where you at through 5 days? Has there been something that would change that with that?
Antonio Hamilton. I don't know if that's a deep cut or not. I'm not even sure I had him making it, but I'm pretty sure he will. I think he's clearly the second team nickel, and I think he probably, D. Alford probably needs to be on his P's and Q's, because I think there's the chance that Hamilton could be the first team nickel on this team. So that's the one that pops into my head.
Okay. All right. That'll be something worth potentially exploring further here on Locked On Falcons. Of course, people, check us out. Make us your first listen on YouTube and elsewhere. And, of course, check out Josh's stuff as it comes. I think the run game stuff is very fascinating. It's been a question I've been contemplating as well, having watched some of the Rams offense over the last year or so to sort of see how they integrate what the Rams do and what the Falcons potentially do in marrying those two things. So that will be something worthwhile for people to check out over at The Athletic. So go check out that stuff. Again, Josh, really appreciate you coming on and sharing your insight so far in training camp.
Thanks for having me.
So, guys, there you have it. Josh Kendall of The Athletic. And we'll wrap up today's episode talking a little bit about the wide receivers that the Falcons just picked up, and James Washington and Jesse Matthews, and sort of what that means. But before we get there, guys, I want to let you know about Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you each and every day to bring you the biggest stories. Check it out, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So the Falcons on Monday signed 2 new wide receivers, James Washington and Jesse Matthews. James Washington has kind of bounced around the league the last couple of years after being a second-round pick with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Notable thing about James Washington is that was my eye-level comp for Frank Darby when we drafted Frank Darby as a player that was specialized as a deep threat in college at Oklahoma State, where Zach Robinson had eyes on him as a fellow OSU alum, as well as James Washington playing in Pittsburgh under Ike Hilliard for a couple of years. But those deep threats that were very productive in college in that role in a limited capacity, but didn't necessarily have the speed to really stretch defenses in the pros and really needed to kind of build a strong rapport with, their receiver in order to be that sort of reliable vertical threat in the NFL. And that just never really developed for James Washington and Pittsburgh outside of a stretch of games where Duck Hodges was their quarterback, but didn't build that with Ben Roethlisberger or Mason Rudolph. And I talked about that in that Frank Darby episode, if you go back and listen to that. And Jesse Matthews playing at San Diego State, I believe, and was an undrafted free agent with the Texans, got hurt last year. But, I think both of these guys are kind of a shot across the bow for Rondell Moore. Right. We talked about this briefly the other day on the podcast, how maybe Rondell Moore may be on the roster bubble. Now, I think at this point in time, we're a long way away from expecting Rondell Moore to get cut. But the thing I mentioned and will mention today is basically if he's not going to win the number 3 wide receiver spot, and it does seem like Ray-Ray McCloud is well ahead of him in that regard by most accounts through 5 days of training camp, that you sort of wonder then, it's the old Office Space meme with like, what is it that you do here, Rondell Moore? Because basically, for those of you that are unfamiliar, this is why we harp on special teams matters. But basically, there's 3 wide receivers on offense that are going to play on offensively in any given week. And if you're going to be active on game days, if you're going to be one of the other guys active, then you got to perform on special teams. This is the thing I always say. Like, there's about 36 to 38 players, depending on what team you're on and how you structure your roster, that will play on offense and defense, and the other, 15, 16 plus players that are going to be on your 53-man roster are there primarily to play special teams. Now, in the event of an injury, then they'll get promoted. But at this point in time, Rondell Moore, because he lacks that special teams experience in terms of coverage, what is it that you do? He's not going to be the returner with Ray-Ray McCloud and Avery Williams both on the roster. Rondell Moore has some experience as a returner, but not productive enough, whether at Purdue or his rookie year at Arizona, to think that he's going to unseat either one of those 2 guys. So that will be interesting. Matthews has some special teams experience. Washington doesn't. Matthews did return punts, I think, in college. Washington really doesn't have. And so, I don't think either of these moves are really going to push Rondell Moore off the roster, just because, again, if you're not going to be the number 3 wide receiver, you got to play special teams, and neither one of these 2 guys, I think, really going to carve out a role. Maybe Matthews, maybe he has a shot for maybe a practice squad spot over someone like a James Washington. But it is interesting to see Ray-Ray McCloud sort of seemingly taking advantage of this opportunity and sort of being one of the bigger surprises of camp so far in terms of seemingly being the front runner. We thought Rondell Moore was going to be the front runner for that number 3 slot receiver role. And it goes back to a conversation I had with Sam Monson earlier this month, where he mentioned Ray-Ray McCloud as someone that Zach Robinson was a big fan of, and that was kind of news to me, and that led us to having a conversation about this number 3 wide receiver battle. But to me, I'm just trying to figure out what is it about Ray-Ray McCloud that Zach Robinson likes. From a skill set standpoint, him and Rondell Moore aren't dramatically different. Maybe Moore's a little bit more explosive. McCloud has a little bit more size, and I think that's probably the reason, not because it really makes a difference in how they play as receivers, but it could make a difference as blockers. And Ray McCloud, at least looking at his PFF grades these last couple of years, has been a plus blocker in previous years for Pittsburgh and San Francisco, while Rondell Moore not so much. And that's one of the things that you have an issue with, being 5'7" and whatnot. But that's important because we've talked about it before, talking about Kyle Pitts sort of being kind of Cooper Kupp-esque in terms of a big part of what Cooper Kupp's value to that Rams offense is his blocking ability out of the slot. And so, one of the things with Ray-Ray McCloud, with Rondell Moore on the roster, is like you're probably not going to get that same juice in the run game from your slot receiver. And that's one of the roles that we're potentially looking at Kyle Pitts having. But if that is the goal, to get someone who has a little bit more physicality at the point of attack as a run blocker, that could potentially lead to them preferring Ray McCloud over Rondell Moore and not really losing a whole lot offensively, since both guys are primarily going to be probably gadget guys than necessarily guys that you're expecting to go out there and catch 50, 60 balls or anything like that. So we'll see how that goes on that front. To make room for James Washington and Jesse Matthews, the Falcons cut Isaiah Wooden, who was kind of basically a Rondell Moore clone, sort of a poor man's Rondell Moore, one of the undrafted free agents they brought in, built very similar speed, that type of thing. And also put Tyler Vrabel on the reserve retire list. And so that kind of speaks to why the Falcons have added so many tackles over the last month or so to their roster. And so, I guess Tyler Vrabel was like, Arthur Smith was my guy because him and my dad were boys. And so he's just like, doesn't have the love to play football anymore. And so unfortunate for him, but we wish him the best in whatever endeavors he decides to get into. Maybe he will decide to get into coaching just like his dad does. So we'll see on that front with Tyler Vrabel. But that is going to do it for us here, guys. Those are my thoughts on the most recent roster moves that the Falcons have made. Again, I don't think Rondell Moore is in danger of getting cut at this point in time. As I mentioned before, like, we need to see one of these guys, whether it's a James Washington, whether it's a Jesse Matthews, a Chris Blair, a Josh Ali, Austin Mack, whoever it is, one of those guys kind of emerge over the next 5+ weeks between now and final cuts. Or I guess we're creeping up on 4 weeks between now and final cuts, I think, at this point in time. I think it's that last Tuesday in August. So so we'll see on that front. But it is something that just to keep an eye on. That in 2 or 3 weeks we might be going like, hey, did you see what Josh Ali did in that preseason game? Maybe he's gunning for Rondell Moore's roster spot, and we'll see if someone else can make it as that 6th wide receiver that will basically be inactive at this point in time. So that is what is in store. Potentially future episodes. Make sure you continue to check out Locked On Falcons by subscribing on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get more insight into that. We'll be joined probably by Jarvis at the end of the week, and we'll see if I can rummage up a guest tomorrow, or we'll talk about some other things on tomorrow's episode. But certainly check us out if you want to get that inside scoop into that, whatever that topic is going to be. So look forward to that. Check out Locked On Sports today, Locked On Sports Atlanta. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.